Silva Arsia, 509 BCE. The day the king was driven out, Rome did not overthrow a king in a single morning. Rome overthrew a king with humiliation, layered for decades, with clenched breaths trapped behind armor, with rage swallowed until it hardened into something fatal, and with a story the Romans would later repeat like a curse and an oath. The story of Lucretia, Tarquinius Superbus. Tarquinius the Proud, the seventh king of Rome. He ruled through fear, through domination. He did not need the Senate. He did not ask. He took. He used violence to bend the city to his will. And worse, his reign taught Rome a truth that would scar it forever. When power has no leash, law becomes a joke, and people become prey. But Rome was still small then, and small cities do not easily destroy the thing that keeps them in order. Not until that order was stained with dishonor. One night, Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, raped Lucretia, a noblewoman famed for her virtue. Lucretia refused to live with the shame. She called her husband and her kin. She told them everything. And then, before their eyes, she drove a knife into herself, not to escape, to prove her purity. Her death was not just a family tragedy. It was a bell, a warning, a signal to every Roman heart. If royal blood could do this to a noble house, then no one was safe. Among those who witnessed it was a man named Lucius Junius Brutus. Brutus was not the type born to start a revolution. Legend says he once pretended to be a fool, to survive Tarquin's suspicion, to avoid being killed like the others. But the moment Lucretia fell, Brutus became something else. A man who could turn grief into a weapon. A man who could turn rage into direction. He seized the bloodied dagger, held it high, and swore Rome would never have a king again. That oath struck like lightning, because for the first time, Rome had a simple answer. They were not merely against Tarquin, they were against kingship itself. Rome rose. Tarquin was driven out, and something new was declared, something dangerous, fragile, and unheard of: the Republic. But the Romans knew what they had done. Driving out a king wasn't like replacing an official. A king had a lineage, allies, wealth, armies, and Tarquin was not the kind of man who accepted defeat as fate. He fled north into Etruria, the land of the Etruscans, a region of rich and powerful city-states. He begged, he raged, he wept. He claimed Rome had betrayed its rightful king. He promised rewards. He promised profit. He promised to restore Rome under Etruscan influence. And to many Etruscan cities, it was an opportunity too perfect to ignore. To reinstall a monarch in Rome and crush the idea that a people could overthrow a king before that idea spread. Tarquin went to Veii and Tarquini, two Etruscan cities with old grudges and great ambition. They agreed to help. Armies gathered, bronze shields flashed beneath the sun, spears rose like forests. And while Tarquin raised his war in the north, Rome, behind its walls, began to understand. Their rebellion was not over. It had only stepped into its blood-soaked chapter. Rome's political reality was fragile. The Republic was a newborn idea. No one knew if it could survive. Rome had no king, but it also had no stable system. So they created a new office, consul, 2 leaders, shared power, rotating rule, so no one could ever become king again. The first 2 elected were Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, Lucretia's husband. Choosing Collatinus made emotional sense. He was the symbol of the uprising's cause, but his name, Tarquinius, it fell like a shadow. Rome had expelled Tarquin, and now a Tarquinius sat in leadership, not the same man. but to the people the sound alone was poison. Yet before Rome could even resolve that tension, the enemy arrived at the gates. Tarquin and the Etruscan host marched south like a returning curse. The first Romans to hear the news understood immediately. This was not just war. This was judgment. If Rome lost, Tarquin would return, and those who rose against him would be crucified, slaughtered, made examples. So every city would learn the lesson. Defy a king, and you die. Rome mobilized. Noble houses sent their sons. Common men gripped spears. They might not yet agree on what the Republic truly meant, but they agreed on one thing. They would not let Tarquin come back. Because if Tarquin returned, Rome would lose everything, not only lives, but the fragile, trembling hope that Rome could belong to its own people. The March day neared. Roman soldiers poured beyond the walls, forming along the dusty road into the open plain. Brutus watched the young faces, men who had never fought a war to defend a system. He knew they weren't fighting for gold or territory. They were fighting for something they didn't even know how to name yet. The Republic was a newborn child, and the enemy was coming to strangle it in its cradle. The battle would take place in a stretch of woodland and open ground called Silva Arsia, the Forest of Arsia. Not vast, but treacherous enough to turn war into chaos. Trees cut vision, tall grass swallowed footsteps, shouts echoed like forest spirits. The terrain made everything personal. You could no longer see the army. You only saw the enemy in front of you. And in ancient war, that meant one thing: it would become killing, up close by honor and fear. The night before battle, the Roman camp was thick with dread. No one slept deeply. They knew the Etruscans were wealthy, well-equipped, and led by a man desperate for revenge. But they also knew, if Rome won, it would prove that kingship could not return by the sword. Brutus moved through the tents, watching the fires flicker. He didn't need grand speeches. He only needed to repeat the oath: Rome will never have a king. And in the darkness before Silva Arsia, that oath sounded like magic. At dawn, mist fell through the treetops. Ranks formed, shields struck shields, spears rose, trumpets screamed, and in the distance, the Etruscan army moved like a river of metal across the plain. The young republic faced its first test, and if it failed at Silva Arsia, Rome's history would end here. Silva Arsia, 509 BCE, when two worlds collided as the sun crested the horizon, mist still clinging to the leaves. The entire forest of Silva Arsia seemed to hold its breath. Rome and Etruria closed in, not like modern armies with clean formations and distant commands, but like two armed masses about to crash into each other with nothing but willpower and steel. Back then, war was decided in the instant of impact, the moment two lines touched, and every theory became nothing more than metal tearing into flesh. Rome formed up with everything it had. They weren't the empire they would become. They were a city that had just driven out its king and was still learning how to stand upright. Their soldiers were mostly farmers, men who armed themselves, carried shields and spears, and hearts that hammered with fear. But they had something other armies didn't. They knew what losing meant. If they fell, they would not simply be defeated. They would be punished as traitors, crucified, slaughtered, made an example. And that knowledge turned fear into desperation. Across the field, the Etruscans advanced like men convinced they were restoring order. Round shields, better armor, cleaner ranks, and behind them, like a shadow that poisoned the air, Tarquinius Superbus, the exiled king. He wasn't in the front line swinging a sword, but his presence made this battle something else. A crusade, a reclamation, a reckoning. In Roman memory, Silva Arsia became the fight where every blade carried one question. What will Rome be? A city of kings or a city of law? Before the clash, Rome's two leaders, Lucius Junius Brutus and Collatinus, walked the ranks. Brutus wasn't the kind of general who commanded from safety. He was a living symbol. His very existence was Rome's declaration. We no longer fear kings. But Brutus also knew this. A symbol that loses its first battle becomes a joke. And Rome. If Rome lost here, there would be no second chance. Then the war horns screamed, and both sides surged forward. The collision at the forest's edge hit like a wall of men slamming into another wall of men. Spears shattered. Shields exploded with impact. Men fell and were trampled before they could scream. The forest of Arsia became an echo chamber of terror. Trees broke vision. Tall grass swallowed feet. No one could see the whole battle. Every soldier saw only one thing: the enemy directly in front of him. Victory wasn't measured in strategy. It was measured in one brutal fact. Are you still standing? And in that chaos, duels between leaders became flashes of meaning. Moments soldiers clung to like signs from the gods. And at Silva Arsia, there was one moment like that. Brutus met Aruns Tarquinius, son of the exiled king. Aruns was not just an enemy. He was kingship given flesh. He was the old regime alive in armor. And Brutus was not just a sword-bearer. He was the Republic's heartbeat. When they saw each other across the slaughter, it was no longer tactics. It was destiny. Legend says Aruns recognized Brutus instantly. His rage wasn't only for lost power, but for the insult of it. Brutus, the man who once played the fool, now standing as leader. To Aruns, Brutus was humiliation. To Brutus, Aruns was the ghost of everything Rome had rejected. Both men spurred their horses and charged. It was the charge of two worlds. No hesitation, no sidestepping, no mercy. Spears struck, bodies slammed, steel bit through flesh, and as if history itself wanted to send a cruel message. Both men died. Brutus pierced Aruns. Aruns pierced Brutus. They fell almost together. Armor flashing in the sun, blood spreading into the grass. The Republic had just lost its founder in its very first battle. If there was ever a moment Rome could break, it was now. News of Brutus collapsing spread like ice down the spine. Roman soldiers, already fighting on thin, trembling resolve, began to waver. In ancient war, when a leader falls, collapse follows. If the head dies, who holds the line? Who gives orders? Who stops the panic? Tarquinius understood that. He wasn't a frontline warrior, but he knew the human mind. He ordered the assault to intensify. He wanted Brutus's death to become a fracture. He wanted Rome to believe the gods had ruled. Those who rise against kings must die. And if Rome believed that, they would fall without needing to be slaughtered to the last man. But Rome did not fall. That was the shock of Silva Arsia. Even with Brutus dead, the Roman line did not dissolve. Because this battle was never only Brutus, it was the soldiers. Men who knew they had nowhere to run. Behind them stood Rome itself, their families, their homes, their future. If they fled, Tarquin would return, and the revenge would be so savage no one would survive it. Many historians say something changed in that moment. A collective spirit began replacing the spirit of a king. Before, Romans fought to serve a monarch. Now they began to fight to serve Rome itself, and that shift was enormous. The battle dragged into the afternoon. Both armies bled. Both armies broke. Silva Arsia became a maze of corpses and snapped wood. No clean victory, no decisive collapse, but one truth emerged. The Etruscans could not shatter the Roman line. They could not reclaim Rome in a single day. And that was Tarquin's strategic failure. As night fell, the formations pulled apart. Both sides were wounded. Both sides had lost men. But their camps felt different. The Etruscan camp simmered with frustration. They came to end this story and found themselves stuck in it. The Roman camp mourned. Brutus was dead, but Rome still stood. Then darkness deepened, and legend speaks of something stranger. A supernatural voice rose from the forest, a god of the woods, a spirit, a whisper from beyond, declaring the Etruscans had lost more men, and Rome was the true victor. Whether real or not, the story served its purpose. It gave the Republic a sign, a stamp, a confirmation. The gods were with them, but in truth, Silva Arsia was not a glorious victory. It was a victory of survival, and sometimes, in history, surviving the first day is the greatest triumph of all. Brutus fell, but the Republic did not fall with him. His death became cement, binding the idea that the Republic could live, even if its creator died. And Tarquin, who had come to return by the sword, began to realize the most terrifying truth of all. Rome no longer depended on one man. Silva Arsia, 509 BCE. The Republic lives, and Tarquin loses his way home when darkness fully fell after Silva Arsia. The forest became something else entirely. By day, it had been a battlefield. Horns, steel, shouting lines colliding. By night, it was a maze of moans, footsteps searching for brothers, whispers of panic from wounded men dragging themselves through the grass. Small fires flickered among piles of bodies, and the wind carried the smell of blood far into the hills, like a curse drifting outward. In ancient war, the night after battle is always the moment fear becomes real. You're no longer fighting, you're only surviving, and waiting to see who comes back at dawn. Inside the Roman camp, silence weighed like stone. Brutus was dead. The man who had birthed the revolution had fallen in the Republic's very first battle. By pure logic, it should have been a killing blow. But Rome was never built on logic alone. Rome ran on honor, on stubbornness, on a refusal to bend. And it was those two things that saved them. The strange story, part omen, part propaganda, spread through the camp like wildfire. They said a voice rose from the trees, a god of the forest, a spirit in the dark. It declared that the Etruscans had suffered more losses, and that Rome was the true victor. Whether it happened or not didn't matter. What mattered was the effect. It gave Roman soldiers the feeling that something higher had chosen them. And in an ancient world where politics and religion were welded together, a divine sign could harden resolve more than numbers ever could. But beyond legend, the strategy was clear. Tarquinius had failed. He came to take Rome back with a single crushing blow. He needed a victory so decisive the city would panic, or so swift the gates would open from within. But Silva Arsia delivered something worse for him: heavy casualties, the Republic's founder dead. And yet, the Roman army did not break. And that is every would-be king's nightmare. When you cannot frighten your enemy into collapse, you are forced into a long war. And Tarquin did not have the resources or the political footing to wage one. At dawn, the Etruscan army did not press for a final decisive clash. They withdrew, partly because of losses, partly because this terrain promised only chaos, but mostly because the Etruscan city-states were not willing to bleed endlessly for an exiled king. Veii and Tarquini supported Tarquin for benefit. When the benefit blurred, so did the support. Rome remained on the battlefield, and Brutus's body was carried home. In that moment, the Republic learned its first brutal lesson. Freedom is never cheap. If the Republic was an idea, then Brutus became its sacrifice. From that day forward, the name Brutus was no longer simply a man's name. It became a reminder. To defy kingship demands blood, and Rome had paid the first installment. But military survival was only half the story. The other half, the half that would decide everything, was political. After Silva Arsia, Rome was left with only one acting consul, Collatinus. And here, something seemingly small became dangerous. Collatinus carried the name Tarquinius. He was Lucretia's husband. He had stood with the uprising. But the name itself was poison. Rome had sworn never to have a king again. And Rome had just learned a new truth. Symbols can be as powerful as reality. Whispers spread. We drove Tarquin out, only to leave a Tarquin in power? In a newborn republic, trust is the most valuable currency, and the name Tarquinius cast a shadow that cracked trust. So Rome made a cold, politically logical decision. Collatinus was forced to resign, and forced to leave Rome, not because he betrayed them, but because his name could open the door to doubt. It was cruel, but it revealed the Republic's first instinct. No individual, no matter how honorable, could be allowed to become a threat to the system. If Collatinus stayed, royalists could weaponize the name. If he left, Rome sent a message. The Republic would not compromise with the ghosts of the old regime. His replacement was elected, Publius Valerius, a man history would remember as Publicola, friend of the people. And this mattered, because Publicola understood something Tarquin never did. If the Republic was to survive, it had to do what kings never did. It had to make the people feel like they possessed a share of power. A famous story survives in Roman tradition. Publicola built a house on the Velia hill, overlooking the Forum, as if he meant to rule from above. The people grew suspicious, and Publicola acted immediately. He ordered the house torn down and rebuilt it lower. A silent pledge: I do not stand above you. Maybe the story was embellished, but its meaning was real. A Republican leader could not look like a king. Publicola passed laws that reinforced the Republic's spine: the right to appeal, limits on official power, protection for citizens against abuse. These weren't just administrative reforms. They were ideological warfare. They were Rome declaring, in law and structure, kingship will never return, not even in disguise. And now Tarquin found himself trapped. He hadn't just lost a battle. He had lost the psychological war. Rome did not break when Brutus died. Rome did not panic. Rome emerged stronger, more conscious, more disciplined, more committed. Tarquin began to understand the most terrifying truth. You can defeat an army, but it is far harder to defeat an idea once it has entered the bloodstream of a people. Of course, Tarquin didn't surrender. He would seek greater allies, most notably Lars Porsena of Clusium, and the struggle would continue. But Silva Arsia was the turning point. From here on, restoring the monarchy would no longer be simple, because Rome had passed its first test. Silva Arsia wasn't like Cannae or Zama, not a masterpiece of tactics and precision. It was primitive, brutal, chaotic. But its value was greater than strategy. It was the battle where Rome proved it could exist without a king, even after losing its leader. If Brutus had lived, the Republic might have been dismissed as the project of one man. But Brutus died, and the Republic still lived. And that transformed the Republic into something far more dangerous. Not the work of a hero, but the work of Rome itself. And that was Tarquin's greatest defeat. He wanted to return by blood. But the blood spilled at Silva Arsia became the cement that hardened the foundation of a new regime. When Tarquin stood at the border and looked back toward Rome, he no longer saw a city easy to break. He saw something new, a Rome learning to become immortal, not through kings, but through law and will.